We are taught that France is the cradle of liberty, the capital of light, and the land of romance. But that is a beautiful lie. France was not built with declarations. It was forged in white bone and absolute brutality. To create the unified nation we see today, the French spent 2,000 years tearing themselves apart. From the Gallic tribes massacred by Caesar to the kings dragged to the scaffold by their own subjects, this land has been a slaughterhouse of ideas. Here lies the strangest paradox in human history: a people who worship liberty, yet remain obsessed with absolute power. A nation of incredible wealth, yet one with a tradition of burning its own cities whenever the social contract frays. Why did a land so geographically perfect become the bloodiest battlefield in history? And how, from the ashes of endless civil war, did a cultural superpower emerge to redefine the world? Forget the love letters and the Eiffel Tower. This is the violent origin of the nation-state. This is not a romance. It is a 2,000-year war for survival. Welcome to Nation Origins. Today, we peel back the velvet of the Republic to reveal the iron of the Hexagon. If you value deep-dive historical storytelling, consider subscribing as we deconstruct the birth of nations. Geography was the first architect of the French identity, offering a bounty that was also a bullseye. Bound by the Channel, the Atlantic, the Pyrenees, and the Alps, France is a natural fortress with one fatal flaw: the Great European Plain. This wide-open gateway to the northeast has invited every invader from Attila the Hun to the panzers of the Wehrmacht. This paradox defined the French psyche. They were blessed with the most fertile soil in Europe, yet cursed with a front door that could never be locked. The great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhone, acted as the nervous system of the land, allowing trade to flow but providing highways for Viking longships to pierce the heart of the interior. Unity built the nation, but it also nearly destroyed it. To hold a land so open and so diverse, the central power had to become absolute, or it would cease to exist. Every mountain range whispered of isolation, while every river bank promised invasion. This was the landscape of a predator that was also a prize, a territory where the climate was mild but the political atmosphere was perpetually storming. Long before the first fleur-de-lis, the land was a mosaic of tribal shadows. These were the Gauls. 3 centuries before Christ, a hunter in the forests of the Auvergne did not call himself a Frenchman. He was Auvergnat or Carnot. Imagine him crouching in the damp undergrowth, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a nearby hill fort. He grips a spear tipped with iron, listening to the rhythmic chanting of a druid performing a ritual of protection over a sacred grove. His world was defined by the clan and the mistletoe, a fierce independence that felt like strength but was actually a death sentence. For the Gauls, freedom was more precious than security. They were masters of metal and fierce warriors, yet their refusal to unite was their death warrant. When Julius Caesar's legions marched north, they didn't end oppose to find a nation. They found disconnected sparks that they extinguished one by one. The conquest of Gaul rewired the DNA of the land. At the siege of Alesia, Vercingetorix threw down his arms at Caesar's feet, signaling the end of an era. The Romans didn't end oppose to just conquer the Gauls. They paved over them. They brought the grid, the stone theater, and the Latin tongue. They turned a wild forest into a province. But as the Roman peace settled, the borders began to scream. As Rome's grip turned to dust, Germanic warriors known as the Franks spilled across the Rhine. They didn't end oppose to come to destroy civilization. They came to claim its corpse. Under a ruthless leader named Clovis, the first seeds of France were sown. Clovis understood a fundamental truth: power is hollow without a soul. By converting to Catholicism, he wedded the brute force of the Frankish axe to the institutional memory of the Roman Church. The king was no longer just a warlord. He was God and oppose, as deputy. But this stability was an illusion. The dynasties that followed were defined by expansion and fratricide. Charlemagne briefly forged an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube, but his death proved that a nation built on a single man's will cannot outlive his heartbeat. His empire was sliced into 3, and West Francia became the Proto-France we know. Yet, the king was a king in name only. Powerful dukes in Normandy and Burgundy ruled their lands like private kingdoms. What looked like strength was already decay. The monarch sat in Paris, staring at a map he didn't and oppose, T. while his vassals built stone fortresses to defy him. But this system was already breaking, and no one could stop what came next. Before we witness the fire of the revolution, ensure you are subscribed to Nation Origins so you never miss a chapter of our human story. The tension between the crown and the nobility reached its breaking point during the 100 Years and Oppose War. This was the crucible where the French identity was forged in fire. For decades, English longbowmen devastated the French knighthood, and the Black Death wiped out half the population. Imagine a mother in a ransacked village in the Loire Valley, clutching her starving child as she watches her wheat field burn, not for a cause she understands, but for a title she will never see. France was a landscape of charred ruins. It was an existential crisis. The country nearly collapsed. In this darkness, salvation came from a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints. Joan of Arc was the human manifestation of a new concept, the idea that the land belonged to the people, not just the lords. Her martyrdom turned a political struggle into a holy crusade. When the English were driven out in 1453, the France that remained was different. It was scarred, but it was unified. The king now had a standing army and the power to tax. The feudal world was dying, and the era of the absolute state was beginning to dawn. But the path to the modern state was paved with the blood of its own citizens. The wars of religion in the 16th century saw neighbors slaughtering neighbors in the streets of Paris, the gutters running red with the blood of Huguenots. It took the pragmatism of Henry IV, who famously converted to Catholicism just to secure the capital, to realize that for France to survive, the state had to be more important than the church. This paved the way for Louis XIV, the Sun King. He turned the nobility into golden-caged birds at Versailles, replacing their swords with silk ribbons and courtly gossip. He was the state. Under his reign, France became the undisputed superpower of Europe, but the cost of this opulence fell on the backs of the peasantry. He built a pressure cooker of unprecedented scale, and then welded the lid shut. By 1789, the pressure became explosive. The French Revolution was a chaotic attempt to reinvent humanity itself. It birthed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but it also birthed the guillotine. Imagine a baker in Paris, his hands covered in flour, holding a pike and shouting for the death of a king he was told was divine. The transition was messy and painful. From the ashes rose Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who took the energy of the revolution and redirected it into global conquest. He gave France a civil code that still exists, but he also left millions dead on the frozen plains of Russia. Napoleon was the ultimate paradox, a liberator who was also an emperor. The 19th and 20th centuries were a relentless struggle to find a balance between the ghost of the empire and the promise of the republic. This was a century of identity crisis, where regimes rose and fell like the tide. In 1914, the Poilu, the French infantrymen, stood in the mud of Verdun, enduring a mechanical slaughter that defied human comprehension. This was not just a war. It was survival. France emerged victorious but hollowed out, a generation of men lost to the machine gun. When the Second World War arrived, the invincible French army collapsed in weeks, leading to the humiliation of occupation and the moral ambiguity of the Vichy regime. Yet, even in the darkness of 1940, the flame of the state survived in the stubborn will of Charles de Gaulle. He understood that France is not just a territory, it is an idea. He fought not just the Germans, but the creeping irrelevance of his own nation. After the war, he created the Fifth Republic, a system designed to provide the stability that had eluded France for 2 centuries. It was a compromise between a monarchy and a democracy, a powerful presidency born from the need to never be weak again. Today, the historical patterns of the Hexagon are as visible as ever. France remains a nation defined by its contradictions. It is fiercely secular yet shaped by its Catholic past. It is a champion of Europe yet jealous of its sovereignty. The strikes in the streets of Paris today are not anomalies. They are the modern echoes of the 1789 Baker. The French citizen still believes that the state is both their greatest protector and their most dangerous adversary. This tension is the engine of the nation. It is a country that thrives on the edge of its own nerves, a culture that treats debate as a blood sport and culture as a weapon. The hexagon is no longer just a shape on a map, it is a fortress of the mind. The story of France is the story of a people who refused to be small. They took a vulnerable piece of land and turned it into a laboratory for the human experience. They have tasted imperial glory and national humiliation, distilling a sense of identity more potent than perhaps any other on earth. They are a nation that lives in the shadow of its own history, constantly fighting to ensure that the hexagon remains unbroken against the pressures of a globalized world. Unity built the nation, but the cost was a soul that never stops fighting itself. As the world shifts toward an uncertain century, where borders seem to blur and old powers fade, the French continue to march to the beat of their own internal drum. Can a nation built on absolute central power survive a world of decentralized networks? Can a culture defined by its borders thrive in a world that wants to erase them? The question is no longer how nations rise, but how they survive what comes after.